What I'm going to do today is to talk to you about GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and it's something that I think is especially relevant to Africa, but it's an issue where there's been a lot of fiction that's been put about by the anti-GMO activists. And when I first found out about this several years ago, I decided that I would organize my fellow Nobel laureates to call for science honesty about GMOs. And we now have 155 Nobel laureates who've all signed up saying that we want the Green parties, the people who are anti-GMOs, to stop scaring the public by pretending that GMO foods must be banned because they're dangerous. And the problem we have with this is that there's simply no evidence for this. It's just some fiction that has been put about by the anti-GMO activists. Now, of course, food means agriculture. We have to be able to grow food for the people who live in cities, for instance. Not everybody has a plot of land in their backyard. And for some 10, 12,000 years, very crude methods were used to improve crops. But in the 1980s, we learned how to be precise. If you look at the corn that typically you find in a supermarket, it looks like the rather nice corn head on the right-hand side. But the wild ancestor was this very thin little thing called teosinte that's shown on the left-hand side. And over the years, farmers slowly found out how to improve the amount of grain, the number of grains that were in individual cobs of corn. And they did this using something called conventional breeding, in which what they did was to take two different varieties of a plant, cross them, make a cross in much the way that humans make babies, male plant, female plant, mix the genes, and eventually get to a hybrid plant that had half the genes from one parent and half from the other, and hope that the gene that you wanted had been transferred into the hybrid. And you would test for this. And then you would cross that back and keep back crossing until eventually you ended up with the desired variety that looked like the first parent but had picked up the gene from the second parent. So it's a very slow process, it's very imprecise, and you pick up a lot of genes that you don't want. Now, the modern method called precision breeding, or GMO, basically you take the gene that you want to put into the plant, put it on a small piece of DNA called a plasmid, and then that will transfer directly into the plant. And this was a method discovered by Mark van Montague and Jeff Shell, who showed that this was a way of getting desirable genes into plants. And Greenpeace says, well, the original conventional method, where you don't really know what you're doing, was safe, mainly because we've been doing it for a long time, whereas the other one must be dangerous. And I'll tell you why they took this approach some time ago, even though there was no evidence that it would be dangerous. But before I do that, I want to give you a simple way of thinking about this for those people who are not geneticists. So what I want to do is to move a GPS system, something that will tell my car where it is, from my old car into my new one. If I want to do this, do I take the two cars apart, all the parts from the cars, disassemble it completely, and then mix them back up, and then select the one that had picked up the GPS? Well, no, of course that's not the way that you would make a transfer of this sort. You would take the GPS from one car, unplug it, and plug it into the other one. And that is essentially the GMO method. This is the approach where you know what you're doing. If I were to take the GPS from an airplane instead of a car and put it in my car, do you think the car is now going to fly? Well, of course not. But the anti-GMO activists would love to make you believe that that is what would happen. It's just not true.